Welcome to Fabric Fodder for this week. I'm coming to you on a different day than usual, on a Wednesday versus a Friday. It's kind of been a bit of a crazy week here in the US. And then Thursday is a holiday and Friday is the first anniversary of my mom's passing. So I'm not sure how good of a mood I'm going to be in on Friday. So I just figured it was better to go ahead and do this today. So anyway, what we're going to be working on is I'm showing you how to create faux rust dyeing. So with this, you're going to be able to create items that look very much like you've collected all sorts of rusty bits and put them together, wrapped them up in your fabric and boiled them and then undone them and laid them out to dry. It's kind of a longer process than what I'm going to be showing you. It's also a little bit more, as I said, controllable. It's always a mystery whenever you're doing any kind of rust dyeing or eco dyeing. You just never know what you're going to get. So this is a little bit more controllable as to what your pieces are going to end up looking like. So hopefully you enjoy these techniques. Go ahead and try them. And we'll be next week. I think we're either going to be doing some stamping or some stenciling. I haven't quite decided yet. So tune in next week for a different technique. And for those of you here in the US, enjoy your holiday weekend or your holiday tomorrow and the weekend after that. So today's lesson, we're going to be talking about faux rusting your fabrics. There's been, over the years, been a lot of talk about the toxicity of rusted iron especially on fabrics, much less on paper, but on fabrics, especially if people are doing it to clothing or it's going to be something that's touching your skin and that sort of thing, because it can be toxic. It can also be toxic if you have actual rust on the fabric and it releases those particles, because that iron can then actually get into your bloodstream and take the place of oxygen molecules or something along that line. Don't quote me on that, but I do know that there is some issues with that. And if you've ever, for instance, cut yourself on something rusty or that, they want you to get tetanus shots and all that kind of thing, but it can be something harmful. So I played around years ago. I played around with this, and then again recently is playing with using different acrylic paints and such to create the look of faux rust. And so this is kind of an extension to a certain extent of painting on wet fabric. And I kind of touched on this during the wet fabric video, but I wanted to take it a little bit further. So I'm going to show you some different things. You've seen a couple of these already. But ways of putting that look onto fabric to create that faux rust look that you can use in your projects. What I want to start out with is some of the paints and such that I use. And I'm showing you some different examples and different kind of looks of what you can use. The most cost-effective ones are using the tubed, whether they're store brands, deco art, folk art, any of those. But you want something, I tend to, when I'm doing the rust stuff, if you notice these are all in threes, I tend to do in 3 different shades. So there's kind of a yellow ochre kind of color. Is that what this is called? Yellow ochre, yeah. A yellow ochre. And this one, it's got a weird name. But I'm typically looking for something that's more along the lines of a burnt sienna, and then a kind of a burnt or raw umber, though the raw umber is more green. So kind of a burnt umber, burnt sienna, and my brain is just a yellow ochre. So those are the kind of colors. So that's in just your tube, inexpensive tube, whoops. Top came off of that. The inexpensive tube, like these are acrylics, Amsterdam acrylics, and let me see what colors these are. Yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and this one I've used a Van Dyke brown. So again, a yellow ochre, a rusty color, and a dark brown, because those are the kind of the colors that come out with when you do a rusted echo dye. To do a rusted echo dye, you have to use some rusty elements and sandwich them in fabric and wrap or clamp them down and then boil them in water. At least that's the way I've always done it. I have created rusty bits by soaking them in a salt, vinegar, water combination. It can rust some things, and that stuff kind of comes off real readily onto fabric. But I much prefer kind of creating that same sort of look. I'm not a super patient person, and going through the whole process of wrapping stuff up and then putting it in the water, letting it sit for a long time, then unwrapping it, letting it dry, pressing it, that's just, that's a bit much for me. Plus, I have a really, really tough time in my area. I'm in the Seattle area. I have a really tough time finding rusty bits. I don't know if there's just a lot of people here that get rusty bits. We don't keep that kind of thing around our house, so I have a hard time finding it. So you may have the same problem as well, but that's kind of part of the reason recently I've kind of moved in, much more recently why I've moved in this direction. Back in the 90s when I played, 80s and 90s when I played with a lot of this stuff, that was purely just, you know, what if stuff. Now I'm much more of kind of coming up with a solution to a problem I've run into. I've also used the high flow acrylics, and again, transparent yellow iron oxide, transparent brown iron oxide, and burnt sienna. And then in the heavy body ones, the transparent yellow oxide, and these are goldens, transparent red, and transparent brown. I tend to use the golden stuff a lot more, mainly because I'm used to the colors, and whether I'm in high flow or heavy body, the colors are about the same. I find the Amsterdam is really similar, and this, I just grab the colors that look best, but I have tried it with these and they work great. So, excuse me. I also like to have usually a gray or a black. And here I've got a sepia. The sepia's got a bit of a greenness to it, and also a raw umber, which has also got a bit of a greenness, so can give it a kind of a corroded look. But I like bringing in either a dark gray or a black as well, just to kind of tone those dark tones when you do some things with rusty colors and such. I've also played around with one of the latest distress inks, which is the Scorched Timber and the Rusty Hinge. The Rusty Hinge, well, on paper it's kind of the right color. When it bleeds out, because distress inks are reactive to water, when it bleeds out, it gets it's a little bit bright yellow orange-ish. That's not my favorite. But one of the things I've done with this is I've added it dry. Once my fabrics are dry, added touches of it, and it does kind of do well that way. But when I do it wet, it gets a little bright orange for me. You may try it and decide you like it. And the Scorched Timber is a great dark color that you can add in as well. So I'm going to show you multiple techniques today, but all of them, if I'm wetting my fabric first, starts with this mixture that I keep in this jar now, and I put a lid on it because otherwise it'll slowly evaporate. And it's a mixture where it's got all three of the colors, and it doesn't matter whether you're using the heavy body or the high flow or just the liquid acrylics. You're going to put it in, I put about a cup of water in there, and then I just put some paint in there. Not a ton. It's probably maybe 20% of it paint, so it's just a good squirt of it, and then, mix it up maybe use a brush or something in there to really stir and mix it up. And then once I've added, and I usually put about equal amounts of all three colors. And then this is kind of when I start playing with it. I kind of test it on some strips of fabric. And that's when I add some of my darker tones, whether it's a sepia, the dark gray, the black, whatever, just to where you get it to it's the kind of the tone that you want. It's not too orange, it's not too dull, but it's just kind of that. You can kind of look down in your jar, and if it looks kind of the right color, it probably is. But you kind of play and tweak with it. If you do a couple, just, you know, some little strips of dipping it down in there to see if it's kind of the color that you want. And once you have kind of the recipe, that's why I go ahead and keep it till I use it all up, and then before I mix another batch. Now what I do with this, so let me just show you. This one I've already cut it in half, but I can still show you, is I take the piece, it's got thread all over the back, and I dip it down into my jar, and I'll show you how to do this in just a minute. And then I scrunch this all up and let it dry overnight. And then you get that peaks and valley things like we talked about. So that kind of gives you almost, this could almost be like a tea dye type of look. So, and so you can see how this is kind of the color. I did one other one, and it was a little more orange. So I'm not sure if, you know, and then so that's when I tweaked my color and gave it a little bit more caramel and less of the orange. I don't know if that's really showing up very well on camera or not, but I'm not overly fond of this shade. I much prefer this one. I do have a piece of, this is a piece of tea dye fabric, so you can see color-wise, it's pretty close. This is just a little bit more intense. And if I left this sitting in my paint soup, it probably would absorb more of the color. So you can do tea dyeing too. So, and this is for two of my samples. So I do have a piece here that, and this is where I put a glove on at least one hand, just because I'm going to be bringing this out. So I just take my fabric and I stuff it down inside the jar and down inside the paint, stir it around, mush it around, make sure that it's good and coated. Then I fish it out. And this is where I grab it with one hand, and then I can squeeze it out. So then I've got this piece that's got the paint on it. Now I can just let it dry flat. Pick up the color. So I just scrunch it all up. Even if this smaller piece maybe kind of even into a ball. Then open it up just a little bit, kind of, so you got those nice peaks and valleys. And then I will usually set this onto a towel. Scared my cat when I reached for the towel. He's like, oh no. So if I set it on the towel, I have found it dries better than leaving it on a plastic bag. So I just will set that, and I let this dry totally on its own. Yeah, I find it just works better than trying to use a heat tool to dry it. So what I usually will do is if I know I want these pieces for the next day, the night before, I'll go ahead and put them in my jar of paint and lay them out on a towel. And by morning they're dry, and then I can press them flat. So I'll take that off. So that gives you what I consider, I call this a dip wash. And you can do this with other colors too. It doesn't have to be just for rust. You can basically dye fabrics just in a jar with some acrylic paint. And it could be, as I said, anything from heavy body through high flow and into just the liquid acrylics. So you just kind of mix until it comes up kind of the color that you want. And like I said, I just start with equal amounts of each of these three because it gives a good rust color. And then add more brown, black, gray, gold, whatever colors till it reaches that level of rust color that you want it to be. So, and like I said, you can do it then with other colors as well. Now, one of the pieces that I had shown you previously, we'll do it on a piece of this. This has this little red on there because the reddish tone, there was a squirt of it that had been on the side of the jar that it hadn't washed out when I put the fabric in. It got on there, but kind of goes along with it. When I'm doing rings, like on here, this is just one of my experiment pieces. With the rings, it's like I had shown in the last class. I just use one of these, since I use canning jars for my water, so I have these lids. And I generally keep them, like I have here, on my water because I like to scrape my brush against the edge. But I took one off of this one to use this. And then what I do is I paint that rusty color on here. And this fabric can be either dry or wet. If you want them a little bit more defined, you're going to kind of, it's almost like we're stamping them on there dry, and then we'll spritz it with water. If you want them to kind of meld out a little bit more, have your fabric be damp. Not sopping, but damp beforehand. And then you can add more water to it, and they tend to bleed out a little bit more, so rather than being defined. So it's kind of depends on what kind of look you're going for. The other part of this lid, of a canning lid, this is another good one for some fatter ones that we're going to try. So we'll paint on that. So to start with, let's go ahead and mix up our bit of soup. Our rust. We're mixing our rust. So a good, maybe a little bit more than that. A good dab of my 3 colors. Doesn't really, as I said, doesn't really matter which one, what kind of paint you're using. As long as it's just in that kind of golden and rusty and then dark brownish rusty. And since these are iron oxides, the pigment, and everything I've read says the pigment used in paints that are iron oxides are not dangerous in the way that iron oxide that bleeds off of actual rust is. So let's go ahead and mix these up. Like I said, about equal, and it gives you kind of just, let me brush that out. See, it's just kind of a nice rusty color when you mix all 3 of those together. So then using my brush, I painted. Now if I want to do a full ring, I paint all the way around. And I don't bother to clean it off from the last time, so it gives it more of that rusty character. So if you want it to look like maybe it was what you were rust dyeing was like a couple rings of wire or something. So I tend to try to make them a little bit concentric. Now I like painting it on there. I have also used a gel plate, you know, to spread the stuff and then stamp on the, to get the gel plate. And that works great too. I just haven't brought in gel plate to what we're doing here just yet. And it's like, and we will, because then that gets a little crazy because there's so much you can do with the gel plates. But I'm just trying to show you, you know, before the amazing gel plates existed, I'm showing you kind of some of the stuff that at least I used to do. I know there's other people who do this kind of thing. I'm just showing you what I've experimented and played with over the years. And this is a little harder because I don't have my gloves on. I just get it tipped over. I don't even know if I was on camera for that. Probably wasn't. And don't be afraid to just do, you know, partial ways around. And if it scoots a little, that's fine. All right, so I did this one on dry. So I'm now going to give it some spritz. with my medium and water mixture, if you watched the last video. And then I also will give it, because it seems to spread better with water than with the medium. And then you just kind of let it sit for a few minutes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move this up on my table, and it'll continue to kind of, if you give it some really wet spots, those spots will tend to bleed a little bit more. So, but just let it kind of soak in for a bit. Okay, now on this one, which is the other half of that piece, I am going to do with some tools that I love to go to the hardware store. And I have a local hardware store. And in the section where they have the materials to do putting up gypboard or the wall board, when somebody's, putting up a wall or constructing a house, these days, it used to be lathe and plaster. Now we use wallboard. And there's all sorts of cool tools in order to give you texture for if you're doing special types of things, or plastering on gypboard and stuff. And I found these cool scrapers. One of them has, and this one is probably more intended for when you're laying tile and you put the mortar down to lay the tile, because these kind of channels is what's typically used on that. I also have this one that has a zigzag. Exactly what these are called, I don't know. I found them at my local store, but you don't have a hardware store that carries anything like this near you, you can cut these just out of some cardboard or chipboard or something, and you can even then make different patterns, creating scrapers that do different things, whether it's with the zigzag or it's with the channels. But this makes some cool stuff, which is what is on this one. This was doing a scraping with the zigzag one, so that just, I scraped it on there. And this one with those wider pieces is just the little scrape across that way. And then I added with a brush some of the dark brown just to give it some of that depth and dimension. So let's do one real quick one first. And again, I'm just painting this onto as close to the edge, because anything up higher isn't really gonna do much. So I'm trying to stay right at the edge with the paint. So then I can just scrape, lay it down and kind of scrape until it kind of gives a stripe. It's kind of cool. And then turn it around, try to kind of line it up, maybe lay it down and get a little bit out of it. That might still be on there. And again, I'm starting out dry and then I'll go to wet. But it kind of gives a cool stripe-like effect. So let me do the same thing with this guy. Just painting it on the teeth of the scraper. There's actually, and some of there's actually some of these scrapers, the catalyst scrapers, that have these kind of textures. I just have a plain one. But that also might work really well for this. So I just kind of lay it as sort of flat. Because this looks like it could almost be like nails or a bolt. This looks like it could be a big heavy spring. But see, I really love this one. See how cool that looks on there. I just think it looks so cool. So then again, oh, the other thing that's in the soup that I forgot to mention is some of my textile medium. So the fabric's already got some textile medium on it because it's been dipped. But I always like to add a little bit more. Now, with this, I'm trying to give it a couple spots where maybe the paint's a little heavier. It's get a little bit more water to let it sit and maybe blur out. As you can see with this one, as it sat, it's kind of blurred out a little bit more. So then with this one, what I do is I take either some of just the straight dark brown kind of color, and then maybe add a little bit of the gray, and maybe some of the sepia because it's got some green to it, so it gives it almost a use a bigger brush. Now I use this kind of, this is a 2-inch, but it's pretty skinny. You could also use one of these kind of flat, these natural hair ones flat, and give it a more floofy look. But because I'm kind of wanting to line up with some of this on there, I will use this skinnier brush and try to get a lot of it off. And then, except brush has been washed, and when it does that, once I wash the brush, it wants to kind of separate itself a bit. And you can kind of go just right by those stripes, between them. And I can wet it down. I grab some of out of my jar, my paint jar. Just kind of the way it just feels like it should go. And then I can let it sit. But it just has a real, both of these, let me slide this one down a little bit, slide this one in, is both of them are really getting that look like it's rust. Then once they're the way you like them, then you can just go ahead and set them over on a towel to dry. And then we're ready. So once they're dry, then you can also add another layer of maybe with the darker or something, dry on top of it, and just let it dry because it's going to come out a little bit more defined. Or for instance, here I used this tool just to add some little squares there. So you can add a little bit to things just to enhance it a little bit more. So the next one we're going to do is something that we did already in the wet fabric painting video using some foil, but it really does kind of give that when it's not necessarily a defined object, but is rather kind of undefined. Let's see, let's just use, since I've used all my pieces, let's just use this one. So I'm going to take some foil. I'm just going to do 2 different ones. Just like we did before, you're going to crumple it to kind of create a texture. And get it relatively the same flatness. I don't want to crunchle it. I don't want to smooth it out too much. But again, I'm going to take my brush and paint it. Because this is going to give you kind of far less defined than if you were even trying to do this randomly with a brush. So this is going to give you just, so it's kind of like a foil stamp. I should mix some more paint up. So trying to just use this because it's not going on real thick. Let's do that. I want it to be a little thicker than that. But when I spritz that, in fact, because I've already stamp that on there. I want to do the water pretty quickly, otherwise it doesn't spread very fast. So I'll just keep it at that area. But see how even while I'm mixing that, you can kind of have an opportunity to watch it kind of spread a little, and you see that rusty color coming out while it's spreading. The wetter you make it, the more it spreads. Now, one of the things, while I'm also mixing this, one of the things you can also do is you can use different kinds of bits and stuff to dip and kind of stamp onto your fabric. You can use like die cuts. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be metal pieces, but you can use things like die cuts and such like that, like die cut keys or other kinds of things. So it looks like you've used a key, but you haven't. So I got a lot more paint on this one. Just kind of gently, without pressing too hard, just gently set it down. So that's got a little bit more paint on it this time. And this is kind of going to kind of, some days my tongue just doesn't work as fast as the part of my brain that's trying to talk it does. I'm just gonna stamp that. It's okay to overlap. And so when you start out dry and then take it to the wet, you tend to keep some areas that stay that little darker tone and some that spread out into the rustiness, which is very similar to what, if you're dyeing with some rusty bits, that it does. So that just creates kind of a cool all over backgroundy kind of thing. You can do different things with your foil. Maybe you want something that's, you know, a long shape or something that you could stamp on there. There's any number of things. And then you can keep these. If they dry so wet, we'll put more paint on top of it. And maybe you want to do a little bit different shape or something. Oh, let's do this. Let's, for this one, let's make some of the darker parts in there. Put a little black and a little of the sepia, because I like that kind of greenish brown in there. That gives it, let's mix it up with this brush, because that'll just kind of give it more of that almost corroded kind of look. Maybe put some of the brown in there too, so that it still looks part of it all. Maybe pop that in some of the areas just to give some darkened tones in there. Perfect. Love how that looks. Maybe give it one more spritz over the dark parts so that then they can go ahead and do their thing. So that's ready to now go ahead and set this off to the side and let it dry as well. Now the last one I'm showing you is using an purchased fabric. Now this is what is called a batik. A batik quilting fabric has a higher thread count than a lot of other fabrics. It's one thing is nice is, while it's a little bit different on each side, it does bleed through to both sides. It's a dyeing process. Now this one's just an overall kind of looks like a hand dyed, because it's just more of an all over dyed looking pattern. But some of them, let me grab a couple. I just happen to have these sitting right here. But you can get batiks that have multiple colors. They always have kind of a watercolory look to them. Or you can do with light ones, and many times they'll have like leaves and stuff. There's like a squillion, just like there's a squillion quilting fabrics, there's a squillion batiks as well. So this happens to be a batik. I went for this kind of aqua with a little bit of the rusty look already in it. So then I can add to it. So I'm going to grab another, we'll grab another one of these brushes that's a little bit on the skinny side. I'll wet it down in my dipping mixture. And then I'm just going to take some of my rusty color. And what I'm doing is what I did on this one, is I'm just taking the brush and I'm just going to create, oh, this one's a lot heavier, and just kind of make an interesting pattern. Now, I many times will use my fabric in strips on my projects, my art quilt type projects. And this one I already am liking how it's looking, so I will most likely definitely use this one. And I will be here shortly as we get a few more different techniques in here. I will be showing you some of my projects that I make from some of this stuff. So kind of lets it bleed out just a little bit. And now I'm going to take some of the sepia and black or dark brown, whatever, you know, kind of feels good to you. Maybe I'll throw a little bit of, with the liquid, some of the rusty color in there, and then mix that up. Because then, while it's wet, now I'm going to add some of this in, and be a really light touch with your black, not as heavy-handed, barely letting it tip, maybe flatten it out. It doesn't have to be quite as heavy through it. And then I get a little more water on top of it. And then let that dry. Now, remember, as always, when it dries, it gets much lighter. So this is done the exact same way, exact same colors, but it does, I think this one, the rust is going to come out a little bit darker. And the beauty on this one is you can decide which side you like. But with this one, the black came out more defined and the rust kind of bled around. But it looks like this one, the rust is going to kind of stay up in the front. But having that little bit of black in there, I just love how that looks. So we'll go ahead and let that one dry, and I'll come back and show you how these look when they're dry. All right, these are now for the most part dry. Before I would use them, I would make sure they are completely dry, and then you'd press them. So there's some places where the paint with this method is a little bit thicker on all of them. And so I just want to let that paint dry totally before I iron these, and then I can use them. But I'm ecstatically happy with how each of these came out. The beauty also with these is you can use either side. For instance, if this one's a little too intense, which is the last one we did, and I totally love how it came out, but I also like the back side, which is a little bit more subtle with the rust. But this looks like a bunch of metal bits, whether it's nails or screws or something, kind of got tossed down. But what I like about doing this is I have a little bit more control than if I'm doing it with an echo dye with rusty bits, because you don't really know what it's going to come out. And while I absolutely love the serendipitousness of that, where you don't know what it's coming out and you're unwrapping in it, it's almost kind of like this big surprise. Some things that you are like, yes, that's going to work great. And then, oh, it didn't. So by doing a faux rust dye type of thing, you have a little bit more control over the outcome. Not completely, but you have a bit more control over it. So then you can create things more specific to a project that you may be working on. A couple other things that I will be showing later on as we continue on this fabric fodder journey is I've also been playing with some things, doing some faux echo dye, again for that exact same reason. I don't have great plants in my my general neighborhood that release a lot of anything onto a lot of the fabrics when I echo dye. I usually end up having to go get eucalyptus from the grocery store, things like that, because I don't know, some of the leaves and stuff just don't want to let go of anything in my area. So I've been playing a lot with doing a faux echo dye and also doing a faux cyanotype, which is the sun printing with the blows. And we will actually be doing actual cyanotype, but I also want to see if I can develop this kind of faux cyanotype, and it's so far coming out pretty cool, but I'm not ready to show it just yet. So anyway, I'm just super happy with how this came up. This is almost like a bunch of rusty powdery stuff or something that was very textured, and just this parts of the fabric we're touching. These rings, I love how this comes out exactly the way it does, and why in some areas I put in more water, and where the paint is thicker, I want to let it dry, because if I were to press it when that's not dry yet, then that paint would essentially come off onto my press cloth. But having these more defined areas and then have these wet areas where it bleeds out, I love that. And then having kind of the background with that crumple from dipping it into the paint and letting it dry, having that background kind of adds to the effect of it as well. And then this last one, I think this one's my favorite. I love that. That looks like I had some sort of tight spring or some sort of big bolt or something with that really super dark in there, as well as just the bled out rusty color. I just love that. This one as well, doing the same sort of thing where parts of it was dry, parts of it bled. And as I said, the more if you concentrate some water in some areas and not saturate the whole thing, you get that effect where you have kind of almost a dryish effect, as well as the, excuse me, the bled out parts. So I'm just super ecstatic with how these 4 came out. So go ahead and mix up your own paint soup to dip in, and grab some paints. As I said, 3 colors plus probably a dark is all you really need. Again, an ochre, a rusty kind of burnt sienna, and a brown kind of oxide color. Whether you're using the inexpensive ones or you're using the golden heavy body or the more liquid, doesn't really matter. Any and all of them can work. And you just kind of play and come up with things like lids and plaster scraping tools. And these are only like $2 at my local hardware store. So feel free to just kind of come up with, play with things in terms of creating your own fake rust. So that's it. Thanks a bunch.